Hello, this is Gregory Ramirez, and this tutorial is an introduction to fiction, which is sometimes referred to as prose. The purpose of this tutorial is to help you to understand the features of fiction so as to help with interpretation and analysis. First of all, it is worthwhile to distinguish the different types of fiction. Please note that the information for this and the next slide derived from the portable 12th edition of the Nord Introduction to Literature, as stated at the bottom of the screen. First of all, the short story generally is 1,000 words in length and may also be referred to as flash fiction or microfiction. This has gained quite a bit of popularity in the past 10 or 20 years. The short story, on the other hand, is generally 1,000 to 20,000 words. A rule of thumb for the short story is that it is a work of fiction that could be read in one sitting. A novella, however, is generally 17,000 to 40,000 words. And finally, a novel is generally 40,000 words or more. Because of its length, the novel can contain numerous characters and events as opposed to the previous three, each of which contains a more narrowed focus. Additionally, I should add how, while we are moving away from focusing on poetry to short fiction, it has been said that short stories have more in common with poems than they do with novels. Many times as well, it is believed that adapting a short story into a film is far easier than adapting a novel, which may be why many who view a film that derives from a novel they have read will in turn say the book is better. I should also point out how a professor once told me how the difference between writing a short story and a novel is similar to running a sprint and a marathon. For those of you who have experience with cross-country or track and field, you probably know how approaching one is different than the other, as the goal of brevity differs from that of endurance. It is worthwhile now to distinguish between what is known as genre fiction and literary fiction. First of all, genre fiction is any work that follows the conventions of a particular genre, such as mystery, science, fiction, romance, and horror. In other words, if you were handed a book and told that it is science fiction, you probably have certain expectations, such as having robots and aliens, as well as taking place in outer space and in the future. Examples of authors of genre fiction would include Stephen King, who is well known as publishing in the horror genre, and James Patterson, who publishes in the mystery genre. Also, genre fiction is plot-driven, meaning that there is emphasis on the events that occur and on surprises that we commonly refer to as plot twists. Literary fiction, on the other hand, though it may contain elements of genre fiction, is not confined to specific conventions. With that said, works of genre fiction can be considered as literary fiction. Some examples include Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 or George Orwell's 1984, both of which contain elements of science fiction. Examples of living authors of literary fiction include Nobel Prize winners Toni Morrison and Kazuo Ishiguro. Also, whereas genre fiction derives or focuses heavily on the events and is therefore plot-driven, literary fiction, is character-driven. This isn't to say works of literary fiction contain no plots. However, the plots may not be as dynamic as what readers might see in works of genre. As for elements of short fiction, as with poems, a short story may contain any of the following elements. An allusion is a reference intended for the reader to recognize for stylistic or thematic purposes. A literary allusion is one where there is a reference to another literary work, usually one that is fairly recognizable. A biblical allusion is one that refers to events or people from the Bible. An historical allusion is one that refers to a significant historical event or person. When looking at style, the person looks at the word choice or diction, along with the sentence length and structure or syntax that the writer uses. Tone relates to how a writer would sound reading his or her work aloud. Again, this can usually be determined by the words used and how they are being used. The theme is the message that the author wants the reader to walk away thinking about. It is possible for literary works to have more than one theme. And as with novels, the short story will contain the following elements. First of all, conflict is important as it shows what the main character would be struggling with. This may be internal, meaning the traditional man versus self. However, since a character can be a woman, this is why you see woman or man versus self on the screen. The conflict can also be external, meaning that it is man or woman versus another man or woman. It can also be a man or woman versus nature. It can also be a man or woman versus society. Regardless of the conflict, there is an expectation that characters will not be the same at the ending as they were depicted at the beginning of a fictional work. That is therefore referred to as character development. Dialogue also relates to what characters may say aloud to each other or even to themselves. The setting relates to where the author chooses to depict the events geographically and chronologically. This can certainly be important in the motives of the characters. For example, a man would probably have different concerns and values who lives in the United States during the 1930s, the time of the Great Depression, as opposed to a man who lives in the Middle East shortly after the war in Iraq started during the early part of the 21st century. The point of view of what is given is also important. With a first-person narrator, the reader will see the use of I and have access to a character involved in the action, as well as easier access to that character's insights or thoughts. However, this has limitations, as not all first-person narrators should be assumed to be reliable or without biases. Even though it is not common, the second-person narration does occur, meaning that the author will use you as if the reader were a character in the work of fiction. Third person, however, occurs in one of three ways. First of all, omniscient is a godlike narrator who can report all actions, words, and thoughts for any given character. However, this is not as common in more recent fiction. The third person limited focuses on the words and actions of characters, but only provides thoughts on one or two specific characters. Finally, the third person objective is where no thoughts are given and the reader is expected to determine what the characters are thinking and believing based solely on the details of their actions and words. This last one aligns with what we might see in films or plays that do not contain voiceover. If there are any additional questions, please feel free to contact me either by email at gregory.ramirez@scccd.edu or by calling me at area code 559-675-4832.